So now we're talking about long division with decimals. First of all, when you're working with division problems, the answer is your quotient. The number you're dividing by is your divisor, and the number you're dividing into is your dividend. When dividing into the other, if you know that the divisor is not going to divide into the dividend to give you a whole number, then go ahead and set up the problem to be ready to work with decimals. And the way you do that is you put a decimal after your whole number and then put a 0 as a placeholder and take this, put as many zeros as you need so that you have enough place values for rounding. And what I mean by that is you always want to divide one place value further than you need to for the place value you're rounding to. Because remember, when you round, let's say I have 23.614 and I'm asked to round to the hundredths place. Well, I have to look at the number after the hundredths place to determine that this is going to round to 23.61 versus 23.62. So you need to have that digit that's one more than where you're actually rounding to in order to round. So in this particular example, we're asked to round the quotient to the nearest whole. So the nearest whole means the nearest ones place. So what's the next place value after the nearest ones place? The next place value is going to be the tenths place. So we need to have a placeholder all the way out to the tenths place, but we can stop there. We're going to go ahead and line up our decimals. So remember that multiplication is the only operation with decimals where you don't line up decimals. With adding, subtracting, and division, you always line up your decimals. So once you know where your decimal belongs in your dividend, then put a decimal right above it where your quotient's going to end up. So once I've done this, now I can divide, and I'm going to divide until I get a number right here in my tenths place, and then I can stop. I don't need to keep dividing because I'm going to round. As you divide, be sure to keep your digits lined up. If your dividend is a whole number, put a 0 at the end of it, like we just mentioned. So that's where we put the 0 here. And the digits that we want to line up are going to be when we subtract here, as well as when we put the number, the quotient for each part of the problem. We want to make sure we line it up. So however many times 26 goes into 73, I want to put that number on top of the 3 of 73 and keep everything lined up. That'll make your problem a lot easier to solve. Now let's say we're asked to round to the tenths instead of to the nearest whole. Well, if we're asked to round to the tenths, we're going to need to have our place values all the way out to the hundredths so that we know what number goes in the hundredths place, so that we know what to do with the digit that's in the tenths place, whether we keep it or round it up. So you'll see here my long division. 26 went into 73 twice, so 2 times 26 equals 52. I subtract that and get 21. And 26 obviously will not go into 21, so I bring my 0 down. 26 will go into 210 8 times. 8 times 26 equals 208, so I subtract that to get my remainder of 2. Bring down the 0, and I get 20. 26 will not go into 20, so I put 0 in the hundredths place. So now I'm ready to round, now that I've taken the answer out to the hundredths place. So I'm going to look at the hundredths place, and since the number in the hundredths place is a 0, that's obviously less than 5, so my 8 will stay an 8 instead of rounding up to a 9. So the answer rounded to the nearest tenths is 2.8. If you had been asked to round this to the nearest whole, what would you have ended up with? You would have only divided one place value after the decimal. In other words, you would have only divided until you figured out what would go into the tenths place. And since it's an 8, the number in the ones place would round up to a 3 if you were asked to round to the nearest whole. In this example, you're asked to divide 28 into 409. And to help you remember which way to put your numbers when you're writing your division bar and know which one's the divisor and which one's the dividend, read it out loud or read it in your head. 409 divided by. That's how you read your division symbol. Divided by. So I'm dividing by 28. Therefore 28 goes on the outside of my long division symbol, and it's the divisor, and 409 goes underneath it, so it's the dividend. You're asked to round to the nearest hundredths, so we're going to need to put a decimal point where? The end of the number, and then how many zeros should we put if we're rounding to the nearest hundredths? Tenths, hundredths, we want to go all the way out to the thousandths because you need to go one place value further than where you're rounding to. So we're rounding to this place value, and we need one further to be able to look at that last number and figure out how to round. What do we do next before we start dividing? We're going to line up the decimals, right? So now we start dividing. So go ahead and divide this and round, and let's see how you do. You should end up with 14.61 or 14 and 61 hundredths once you divide, and here are the steps. Keep in mind a couple of notes about notation. Dividing with decimals is the same as dividing with fractions. So let's look at a couple ways to think about dividing. First of all, 0.5 divided by 0.75. 0.5 is the same thing as 5/10ths, right? Because 5 is in the tenths place. 0.75 is the same thing as 75 hundredths because the 5 is in the hundredths place. So that they're read 5/10ths and 75 hundredths, whether you're looking at these numbers as decimals or as fractions. So you could actually complete this problem by using fractions and multiply 5/10ths times the reciprocal of 75 over 100, which is 100 over 75, cross cancel. I can simplify a little bit more here. And the answer is 2/3 as a fraction. Now that doesn't give me an answer as a decimal, but it does give me an answer as a fraction, and of course we all know that that's the same thing as 0.6 repeating. So that's one way to look at it. 20 divided by 0.4 or 4/10ths is the same thing as 20 divided by 4/10ths. Again, that's the same thing as 20 over 1 times the reciprocal of 4/10ths, which is 10 over 4. You would cross cancel here. And we actually end up with 50. And that is the same thing as 20 divided by 4/10ths. Notice 20 divided by 4/10ths is the same thing as 20 divided by 4/10ths. So you can play around with your notation some with division and with fractions. So you cannot divide by a decimal just like you cannot divide by a fraction. So we remember what I just went over with dividing by fractions. You have to change division of fractions to multiplying by the reciprocal. You can't actually divide by a fraction. Same thing with decimals. In addition, you cannot have a decimal in the denominator of a fraction because fractions are considered the same as division. So even though 20 divided by 0.4 came out as 20 divided by 0.4, we couldn't leave this as our answer because we have a decimal in the denominator, or we're dividing by a decimal. So there are several things that you could do in this case. I showed you one previously, but another thing you could do is you could multiply by 10 on the denominator, which would move your decimal over one place and change this 0.4 to a 4. But if you multiply by 10 on the denominator, what else do you have to do? You have to multiply by 10 in the numerator. and because that's the same thing as multiplying by 1, right? So what we're finding is an equivalent fraction by multiplying by the value of 1. So when we do that, we end up with 20 times 10 is 200. 0.4 times 10 is 4. And of course 200 divided by 4 is 50. Again, we figured this out using fractions earlier as well. So what I want you to notice here, however, is how and why we change the 4/10 into a 4. Because when we're working with division, as long division, we cannot divide by 0.4. We'd have to divide by 4. But in changing that 0.4 to a 4, we have to change the 20 to a 200 as well. So ultimately what you end up doing when you're dividing is you multiply by whatever power of 10 that you need to multiply by to move your decimal in your divisor as many places as needed. If I want to move it one place, I multiply by 10. If I want to move it two places, I multiply by 100, etc. And if I multiply my divisor by something, I have to multiply my dividend by something because of the fact that we're basically making this an equivalent problem. We're keeping the problem to be the same value. As we saw with this example here, multiplying by 10 over 10 is the exact same idea to keep our problem equivalent or keep our fraction equivalent. So of course when we do this, we end up with the 4, because 0.4 times 10 is going to move that decimal one place over to a 4, and 20 times 10 will move that decimal over one place to 200. So that's how we can not deal with fractions and just change our problem very quickly. But I want you to understand why we do this to help you remember the rule. So to recap, there cannot be a decimal in the divisor. There can be a decimal in the dividend. That's okay. There can be a decimal in the quotient. That's okay. So rules for changing a division problem with a decimal in the divisor. Move the decimal in the divisor until it is at the end of the divisor, turning the divisor into a whole number. So in this example here, I move it one space to change 1.2 to 12. Then count the number of spaces you move the decimal in the divisor. We moved it 1. Move the decimal in the dividend the same number of spaces. Same idea as multiplying by powers of 10. So we're moving it one space here, and this becomes 2.4 instead of 0.24. Write your new division problem and line up the decimal for your quotient over the decimal in your dividend, and then divide. So that's what we see in this step. New problem, we're lining up our decimals, and then we divide. Go ahead and try the rest of the problems. The first handful is just asking how many places you're moving the decimal. So like in this place, in this example, you're moving your decimal one place. So the answer is 1. And then if you scroll further down, you have some examples where you're asked to actually divide. Show your steps and round to wherever it says to round to, and then check all these answers. I'm quickly going to scroll through the answers. You can stop any of these at any time or pause.